To walk out of his will is to walk into nowhere.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 12, Perelandra, Chapter 9, The Venusian Frog Massacre. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack, your favorite weekly C.S. Lewis podcast, run by three Thulkandrians, Andrew, David, and myself, Matt. This season, we're once again following the adventures of Ransom, who this time is exploring Perelandra. And today, Ransom encounters something truly shocking on Perelandra. Well, we've got a lot to get through today, and I have a feeling this is going to be a deep conversation. I was actually fully interacting with ChatGPT because I wanted to just think through the philosophical principles of this, the moral arguments happening in here, just in a brainstorming session. So I just share that because there's going to be so much. We'll circle back to that, but briefly, gentlemen, how are you guys doing?
Doing well. It's a busy season in my business, but lovely. We're off this weekend to Kristen's family has the Ditchfield Family Singers, and they're hosting their 25th annual Christmas show. So going from this to a diocese meeting and then off to Sarasota. But lovely to spend a little time with you guys this morning and our listeners.
I do love that Matt spent his time preparing with ChatGPT. So speaking to something that isn't human, automaton, corpse-like.
The modern Unman?
Unman.
Oh, wow.
As for me, I got a hilarious message from one of our listeners, Summer, saying that her kids always insist on drinking out of her husband's Pints with Jack glass all the time. So they got them glasses for Christmas, so her husband Mike can finally get his glass back.
That's parenting at its highest form. So cheers to you, Summer.
The future generation of Pints with Jack listeners.
Yes. Exactly. They will be listening to Alexander for many, many years. Actually, speaking of which, he was sick this week. And when I say sick, I mean just everything. It was horrible. That was a very, very long night. It started at 10 o'clock and went through to the following day. But surprisingly, this is the first time he's been really sick as someone that can talk to me, and it was very strange. It was very much a bonding experience. It was very sweet. And then as he had a quiet couple of days afterwards, as he was getting his strength back, we chatted a lot more, and I asked him about what he wants to be when he grows up. At the moment, construction worker is top of the list. And he asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up.
I hope you said construction worker.
Oh, I told him I would work on his team.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Well, gentlemen,
lovely.
We are going to be drinking some more of the Best Day Brewing.
Okay, here we go.
You guys will be doing the West Coast IPA. I actually just grabbed the Hazy IPA.
Words are hard.
I know. Well, you know what? David, I thought this was a moment where you wanted disobedience for me to grow older, but you wouldn't tell me. So I deviated from the request.
No, Matt, sometimes I just want obedience.
He's like, it's more unlikely that I get obedience than disobedience.
Can I get some props for my flex here?
Oh,
I'm holding up my Eagle and Child branded glass. Thank you very much. Thanks to John Bowe from Kansas.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to be toasting our new Patreon supporter, Jody Gabrielson. Sorry if I said that wrong.
Gabrielson.
Jody, as we raise this glass here, and we're about to enter into arguably a darker chapter.
Not arguably.
We pray that whenever Satan comes with temptations of thought and half-truths, that the deep inner voice of our crucified Christ would come to you and just speak truth against the half-truths.
Yes.
Cheers.
And like the lady, sleep in peace. Cheers.
And sleep in peace.
Cheers.
I like that.
Well, this episode is going to be going out on December 31st, so that might be the last time you're allowed to do. Actually, you might. No, you can do that again next week, but then after that, 12 Days of Christmas, I think on our publishing schedule will be up. So I hope everyone enjoyed that.
So what? This is the sixth day of Christmas, and Happy New Year to everybody too.
And we also need to do a little toast. We totally forgot to Taylor Swift because it's her birthday today. I just lost half the listeners.
We're recording on Friday the 13th.
December 13th, guys. I just made David and Andrew older.
Oh,
okay.
Yes. Older than we wanted to be.
To Taylor Scholl, our engineer. To Taylor.
To Taylor Scholl. The only Taylor that we actually care about, all of us. Oh, Matt.
Yep. Yeah.
No, nothing.
Well done, David.
Oh my gosh. I'm sorry. I don't sound well. I've got a little frog in my throat.
Here is my summary of Chapter 9. Ransom follows a trail of mutilated frogs and discovers a possessed Weston. Ransom later finds him tempting the lady to sleep on the fixed land, saying that Maleldil wants her to disobey his commands, and in so doing, grow wise. Ransom explains that only hardship came from Earth's disobedience, but Weston points out that this resulted in something good, Maleldil's incarnation. When Ransom asks the thing possessing Weston what happened to him when Maleldil became man, Weston howls like a dog. The lady goes to sleep, but throughout the night, Weston torments Ransom by incessantly saying his name. So, as usual, the chapter begins with Ransom waking up, and once again, Perelandra showers him with all the necessities of life. Food, shelter, drink. The land is good, and he actually takes a walk by the sea on what is described as a soft carpet of saffron-colored vegetation, which even smells good.
Yes.
Now, he doesn't see the Green Lady or Weston, but what does he see?
Well, before we get to what he terribly sees, there's an echo of Lion the Witch in the Wardrobe, because it describes Father Christmas's coat as bright as holly berries. And here we do have bright and round as holly berries. So here's Lewis echoing himself. But there's something much more sinister that he sees when he wakes up is in there, Matt.
Yeah, and I don't know if I really want to read the description of it, but it was one of the, let's just say, brightly colored frogs, significantly, and what came across is like methodically injured.
Yeah, it's a kind of methodical cruelty. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so not just injured, but mortally injured. And he's just horrified at it. And the whole, just like with Ransom's lie earlier on, the whole planet seems to kind of recoil against this unmitigated evil in front of him. It says that he had seen nothing dead or spoiled in Perelandra, and it was like a blow to the face.
I underlined that too.
Yeah, he says it was not merely a pity for pain. The thing was an intolerable obscenity which afflicted him with shame. It would have been better also, he thought in the moment, for the whole universe never to have existed than for this one thing to have happened.
And I love that, because that's an actual true description of the results of sin and death.
It's a description of it, but it's not actually true. It is better for sin and death to have entered the world and then been redeemed than for it to have never entered at all.
Right. Right.
We're not antinatalists here.
No.
But speaking of death, he decides to euthanize the creature, and it gets even worse. This is a very sad portion of the chapter, but it's also kind of funny because although he has this theoretical belief that the frog is such a low creature on the chain of being that it couldn't feel much pain, he decides to try and kill it, and the frog proves remarkably hard to kill. It's only as he's going through this he realizes, I shouldn't have even started trying to do this, and that I've actually increased the sufferings of this creature. It took nearly an hour. And I did wonder, is this actually the first death on Perelandra? And whether Lewis is specifically thinking of euthanasia here. Because despite the sort of almost comic situation where he's trying to kill this frog and this frog refuses to die. If anyone's seen Me, Myself and Irene, there's a scene where Jim Carrey tries to kill the cow and it keeps coming back. It keeps coming back. I wonder if he's trying to address that taking upon himself the decision to kill a creature was actually not his to take.
He's trying to put it out of its misery or give it a mercy killing. But all of that injury, I don't know if it's the first death on Perelandra. I imagine that, we don't know how old it is when we get there.
He can eat the plants. So
yeah,
it's a form of death.
Yeah, so there's vegetable death, but it's certainly the first unnatural death and the first intentional wounding, as we'll soon find. I wonder, and I hadn't thought about it until you just spoke, David, so kudos. I wonder if maybe it's harder to die. He finds it harder to kill it because life is so much more potent and powerful in Perelandra, being an unfallen world. And so, yeah, brilliant.
That actually crossed my mind. Not joking this time. That was what I was going to speculate to your question.
Yeah.
Well, Ransom continues his walk, And what does he see next?
Another.
I love the line, he called aloud upon heaven to break the nightmare or to let him understand what was happening.
Not a bad cry. What do we say? Lord, lighten my load or strengthen my back. Either stop this or help me to understand. And so part of this is his own limitation and confusion. And I think that that Ransom's ability to perceive evil grows during this chapter for sure.
I was trying to figure out what he was trying to communicate, but it was, or what Weston was doing, but he essentially just says he sees more, but it's like a trail of over 20. Boom. And honestly, it came across methodical as well. Boom, 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 like cadenced. And finally, at the end of this, he sees Weston just tearing into one. And we do get the words surgically. And so it's just, it's a really creepy progression. Mary Margaret listened to this in audio book, and I guess whoever reads it, it really came across quite diabolical sounding. And kind of shook her a little bit.
As it should.
Yeah.
There was an interesting principle, too, that his killing takes nearly an hour. He was sick and shaken. Lewis almost always, he frequently portrays conflict in terms of the war or in terms of the of his secondary school, of his prep school. It seemed odd to say that this evil was so surprising and shaking to him. It seems odd to say this of a man who had been on the Somme, this horrific battle in the French Valley. But the architects tell us that nothing is great or small save by position, which is a very Macdonaldian idea. MacDonald talks to his little queen shrinks and grows, and so this idea of size is important, and we find the precursor of Yoda in Rebuttal. Judge me by my size, will you?
But in Weston's destruction of these frogs, it seems methodical, but also somewhat disinterested. He just wants to spoil things for the sake of it, just because they're there. It's like Alfred in The Dark Knight when he says, some men can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
Oh.
You may congratulate me on my Michael Caine impression.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But if you prefer something a little bit more biblical, in John 10:10, Jesus says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. Yeah. And then he says, but I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. And that little line there, that's going to come back a little bit later. But how does Ransom respond to Weston after he sees him mutilating the next frog?
It was interesting. This I got the vibe of a little bit the Great Divorce here, but to a darker, more diabolical sense. So first of all, he sees him and he starts pointing out that he looks like a very dead individual, so not sick. And that's what made me think through a bit the Great Divorce, because it was like a soul completely gone.
Incavatus in se.
Yes, but like to an extent beyond anything we see, obviously, in the Great Divorce, to the fullest of extent. I guess maybe some of those ones in the Outer Rim that he discusses, but yeah, it was unreal. He'd never seen anything like it.
And it's not just a soul gone. Weston's body is cadaverous.
Yeah.
Right? But there is, instead of a soul gone, it's not only his soul oppressed, but there's another spirit, and we'll find out more about that soon, alive in him, animating. And this whole thing, especially when the thing owning Weston plops him down, reminds me of the guy in Men in Black, right? When the alien comes and puts on the guy's body. And
that was where my mind went to.
Yeah, I figured. So, yeah, there's something really, really diabolical is exactly the right word.
And it's from this point forward that Lewis starts describing the person in front of him in impersonal terms.
Yes.
It looked at Ransom. He described it as the thing, and Weston's body said.
Yes. That's another thing to pay attention to in Lewis. He doesn't assign gender until gender is clear. So like he calls Mr. Beaver it until he identifies himself. And so if he's uncertain about what a thing is or what gender it is, he describes it in neutral terms until it takes on some kind of personality or whatever. And here he does the opposite. Weston goes from a he to being an it. And that's an interesting question. Do angels have gender? So, but probably for another day, right?
Well, we're going to return to that more general question of gender later in this season. But I'm going to call him Weston for the rest of this episode, and then he's going to get a new name when it's officially revealed at the end. But the next portion of their interaction is just really creepy. Weston smiles silently at him for 2 minutes. And the writing is wonderful, because it's Lewis. And it says, "It did not defy goodness. It ignored it to the point of annihilation. Ransom perceived that he had never before seen anything but half-hearted and uneasy attempts at evil. This creature was wholehearted."
And you used a term before that. So you just described what he calls a devilish smile. And so I underlined that the second I came across that. And so that was a description for it. I mean, it's incredible.
And Ransom steps forward towards him. He stumbles, he falls, he fails to get up, and he seems to pass out. I love the description. There was a moment of darkness filled with the noise of roaring express trains. And he wakes up alone, and he thinks about what he's just seen. And he talks about philosophers and poets and children basically understanding that there might be a face that you see that is like a torment of hell. In fact, one of the torments of hell would be to see the devils. And he talks about that there's a face above the worlds, and to see that is joy, i.e. God's face, the beatific vision. But there's also another face, which he calls the miserific vision, namely that of Satan.
I wasn't able to look it up. I should have. But in the fulfillment of all desire, one of the saints, I want to say Catherine of Siena, but maybe it was Teresa of Avila, was presented the vision of seeing what true diabolical nature looks like when you fully give yourself. And it was so profoundly powerful in the sense that it was beyond anything she could ever have imagined. Like, we don't fully understand what true diabolical nature is. And I think Lewis did a really good job here, actually, of this is when you become a heavenly or hellish creature. I mean, I love that. Obviously, it's an easy concept to understand, but it still leaves a lot wanting in terms of like, what is a hellish creature? And I don't think we really ponder that deeply enough. And this gave a little taste of it.
And in this time in Lewis's life, he's also writing Preface to Paradise Lost. And one of the criticisms of Paradise Lost is the fact that the devil is just too interesting. Holiness in that book is a bit boring, and the devil seems much more interesting. And so I do think this is something that Lewis rectifies in his own work here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can see all these things kind of at play. And so it's Screwtape, Preface to Paradise Lost with Milton's Devil. He's also writing about the nature of evil in the broadcast talks that become Mere Christianity. So there's a great deal of thinking about all of this evil going on right now.
So Ransom gets up, and the text says he knew that he must either try to prevent it from meeting the lady, or at least be present when they met. What he could do, he did not know. But it was clear beyond all evasion that this is what he had been sent for. I've mentioned several times, he's like a knight on a quest. He's discovered his quest at this point. He must defend the lady against this, what used to be Weston and is now something else. And it says, Weston's body, traveling in a spaceship, had been the bridge by which something else had invaded Perelandra. Whether that's supreme and original evil, i.e. Satan, in whom Mars they'd called the Bent One, or one of his lesser followers, it made no difference. And he's quite surprised that despite realizing this terrifying mission, he's able to act and think clearly, as many soldiers do when they go to war, when someone is struck down by some serious illness. And after several hours, he spots the figures, and half an hour later, he comes to Weston and the lady. And the lady's transfixed in her conversation with Weston, so Ransom just sits down beside her. What is Weston arguing?
He's back again, talking about goodness and helping her to imagine what might be. He's steadily working on the temptation of her. And one has to wonder if maybe this was not, perhaps how it was with our mother, with the first lady in our world, with Eve. We get one snippet of the account, but we don't know how many days that temptation was going on.
Well, I did appreciate she had a good response here. She's very clever. So I don't think remember when we were talking about this last time, I don't think she responded so well. Here she's like, it's not from making a story that I shrink back. So the whole concept of what might be, she's recognizing that's not the issue. It's about specifically what he's asking her to think might be. And that's where the real issue is specifically focused on, which is this whole idea of living on the fixed land and what that would look like. That's just as a reminder to listeners, is the quote unquote what might be.
She can imagine lots of different things, her future children, her life with the king. But when she tries to imagine what it would be like to be on the fixed land, she doesn't know really what to do with Maleldil. And she says, for if I make it that he has changed his command, that will not go. And if I make it that we are living there against his command, that is like making the sky all black and the water so we cannot drink it and the air so we cannot breathe it. Basically, her entire world falls apart if she tries to imagine her going actually against his command. She does question, what's even the pleasure in imagining these things? And Weston assures her that she will be wiser, and that's how the women on Earth have become so great and so beautiful. And there are Genesis echoes there in terms of the promises of the serpent as to what will happen when Eve eats the fruit.
Yeah, the lust, the flesh, the eyes, and the pride of life.
Ransom then interjects and pleads with the lady not to listen to Weston, and in fact just to send him away. And she's pleased to see him, but he notes the hint of something precarious in her face. Something now is not as secure as it was before. Something's at risk. But the Queen's entire reaction to his interruption is kind of amusing. How does she react to it?
Well, remember, she's not living on a world where there's many people, so she had never experienced an interruption in a conversation. So she was taken a bit aback about how she's having a quote-unquote one-on-one with Weston, and then this third party, if you want to call it that, comes in and just interrupts/interjects, and she's just not really very familiar with how do I talk to two people at once.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because we have got a very clear impression that Maleldil speaks to her. So it seems that when he has done that, he has never interrupted.
That's a really brilliant point, by the way.
I'm pretty brilliant.
Well, it's true. And yeah, he's almost as brilliant as he is humble. So, there's that.
Well, I'm thinking right now, the reason I say that is I'm thinking right now of the whole thing of Henry Nouwen. Andrew, your wife would love this, but just the whole idea of silence, solitude, and stillness, 1 Kings 19. And we need to still our hearts. We need to silence our minds if we want to be able to hear the voice of God because of what David just said. I never really thought about that. And that's here we're seeing that God does not interrupt. Well, I mean, I guess some people could push back, say there are examples of it. But.
Or at least not usually. I think Paul of Tarsus might have something contrary to that.
I was literally thinking that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's also this, I love how Lewis looks so carefully at things. And so we've had a really lovely description of what it's like to faint. And, Lewis puts that into language. He also says she had no notion of how to glance rapidly from one face to another or to disentangle two remarks at once. And so that's what we do. And I had never noticed that that's how conversation goes or whatever. So,
and also the unfallen lady is like most introverts in a conversation. They want it with few people as possible.
Yes.
Now, Ransom explains his interruption by saying that he doesn't want the lady to listen to Weston at all. And he wants to call Weston bad, a liar, an enemy, but he knows that she's not going to know what that means. And so he decides that he's going to communicate this idea of badness by building on his earlier conversation with her about Satan, whom he described as the great Eldil, who had held on to the old good and refused the new one, basically what came at the hand of Maleldil. But before he gets a chance to speak, Weston jumps in and he poisons the well. How does he take advantage of Ransom's pause?
Yeah, he more or less creates this narrative that Ransom, first of all, is young and like wants to resist the idea of even becoming older. And so kind of like one of those small individuals that doesn't want to grow, that doesn't want to become older or wiser. And so really plays that narrative up.
And he also accuses Ransom of Satan's sin.
Oh.
Ransom described Satan as the great Eldil who hold on to the old good and refuse the new one. And then Weston says he wants to keep you young. He does not want to go on to the new fruits that you have never tasted before. He's too much of a traditionalist.
Yeah.
And he points back to Ransom's conversation with the lady about the creatures on Malacandra, the Hrossa, the Saroni, and the Fifiltriki. He says, he did not know that all was new since Maleldil became a man, and that now all creatures with reason will be men. You had to teach him this. And when he had learned it, he did not welcome it. And what's the really important thing to know about that conversation? Weston was not there for it.
Yes.
Yet he has supernatural knowledge of that conversation.
Yes.
I missed that.
Yeah. Well, and remember, the narrator says it's Weston's body that says these things. So there's something else, it's a hand puppet moving Weston's lips. And so we begin to slide right into this infernal and eternal knowledge that's going on. And so it's not just, it's not a fair fight anymore. It's not Ransom fighting against his old school chum. It's Ransom in as much of his right mind as he has and his body fighting against Weston's body possessed by something very, very much older and very much more powerful.
Yep, a supernatural intelligence. And he also points out that Ransom wouldn't teach her about death. And he said, wasn't he the very person who gave you the idea that it was possible to not desire the wave that Maleldil sent towards us?
Oh my gosh. And he talks about finding death, and with death, the real oldness and the strong beauty and the uttermost branching out. You must plunge into things greater than the waves. And so this whole kind of psychology of temptation, this is almost, I think, more deft than Screwtape. I mean, you're getting the real psychology of temptation, and some of what you're seeing, I think that Lewis is conceiving this because these are some of the arguments perhaps that he had gone through and some of what he's meeting in modern culture and in modern scientism. And so, I mean, this chapter gives me the shivers.
Yeah.
And it's necessarily more subtle than Screwtape, because in Screwtape explains what he's doing. Here, we just see him doing it. So he calls upon her courage. Courage is a virtue. Courage is a good thing. Testing point of every virtue, Lewis says.
Right.
But he says, you're going to need that if you're going to grow in this way. She is going to require courage in order to sin.
If there's anything to my point that courage is related to love, right? Courage means to be of a good heart. And they're playing with the very idea of love. And love comes up all over the place in the chapter. We find out later that love is the first thing that she's commanded to. And so if love is going out of the self, Weston and the body, the spirit that controls him, is trying to get her to turn into herself. And we'll see more of that in coming chapters.
I'm curious your guys' thoughts. I mean, we get here. He tells him, I've come here that you may have death in abundance, but you must be very courageous. Everything you were just saying, David. But I'm really curious your guys' thoughts. We're back to death. I mean, remember Out of the Silent Planet, wisdom of death was arguably one of the more core points of this. That made more sense to me, that if you're in a fallen state and you've now got a warped view of death, we need to teach you a wisdom of death to kind of right order your thinking. But I guess, and maybe I'm answering my question as I say this, but it seems a little bit less intuitive to flip it the other way. So now she's already rightly ordered. Why is teaching about death a strategic ploy for corrupting someone?
Well, I would suggest, first of all, notice the inversion of John 10:10, that passage that I mentioned earlier. I came that you may have life and have it in fullness, in abundance. What does the Unman say? It is for here that I came, that you may have death in abundance. Mm-hmm. He is promising something with this. And just interestingly, I found out that Chesterton, this death in abundance, he makes a similar comment in the Everlasting Man about the Albigensian heresy. Mm-hmm. But he's going to use this as a vehicle to twist the lady. And he says, I will speak greater words than these, but I must wait until you are older. Even this is an echo of Scripture. It's in John 16, where Jesus speaks about the Holy Spirit. I have many things yet to tell you, but you cannot bear them now. But when the Holy Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. What she's talking to is an antichrist, an inversion, a Screwtapian vision of the world. And so he's going to teach her something about death that is going to, in his mind, lead to her fall.
Right. And this kind of nefariousness, and he's weaving a much larger pattern, and he's dropping little things, and he's going to pick up on them later, and that's the nature of temptation. And that's part of why Lewis in Mere Christianity says, the loss of a hill today may seem of no great consequence, but it leads to a loss in the battle, later on. And so this kind of blind obedience. And what does Screwtape say? Our cause is never in more danger than when the man feeling no feeling, looks about on a bleak landscape in which God seems to have gone and yet decides to obey anyway. Right.
And Matt, I would also point you back to the Genesis account, because what did God say would happen when they consumed the fruit? On that day you will die. What did the serpent say? You will not die. the serpent wanted to teach them something about death that he said that God was holding out on them. He hadn't explained it fully. But as we discover in the Genesis account, there's death, and then there's death, capital D.
And the devil says, you will not surely die, right? Not that you won't die, but that you can't really rely on the person who was talking. So he moves, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, the kind of tactic of the sick or the evil or the twisted is defend, deny, accuse, attack, right? I have every right to do this, or the gaslighting, you're not seeing things the right way, or you're guilty of the same thing, and then the out-and-out attack. And we can see all of these things happening in the relationship between Weston and the Green Lady, and especially Weston and Ransom.
In response to the lady's request for Weston to make her older, Ransom suggests that it would be better to let Maleldil make her older in his own time and in his own way. And Weston never looks at Ransom whenever he's making these objections. He never looks at him to respond to him. But he points back to yet another earlier conversation that Ransom had with the Queen, where Weston wasn't present, where Ransom said that Maleldil was beginning to let her walk by herself. And he suggests that this was the reason that she and the king were separated. And Ransom had said something sort of similar. And it was so that she could learn, in this case, from Weston, and make herself older. How does Weston now approach this idea of disobedience to Maleldil?
It's so nefarious. It's so subtle. She knows that when you know what Maleldil wants, and yet you wait for his voice, that's a kind of disobedience. The wrong kind of obeying itself can be a disobeying, which is true. I mean, it's not like 50-50. There's so much truth in what Weston says and just a little bit that's wrong. And it's just so twisted. And she compares it to the game that she plays with the animals. Like when she chases the animal, she'd rather have the animal run away than just stand there and be caught. And so the animal's disobedience is part of the game. And she wants the animal not to just stand there. It's a kind of disobeying, which is something that she wants. And man, Weston is diving right into the middle of all of this.
And Weston asks the question whether she knows for certain that Maleldil wishes her to always obey him. And he points back to the animal game that you mentioned. They run away, and that's what she actually wants. But the lady's response, she really comes through really well in this chapter. She points out some problems. Because she says, the beast knows that I want it to play, and is therefore playing along with the game. And surely God doesn't play games like that. And Weston responds that, no, this is just an analogy. One thing I wanted to point out, throughout this conversation, he's showering her with compliments. Lots of flattery. Oh, how wise you're growing, beautiful one. But Weston asks if it's possible for her ever to grow up unless she at least seems to disobey Maleldil. Matt, what does he mean by this?
The way I had interpreted it is the idea, but a twisted, perverted. So I'll do the non-twisted a little bit easier to explain. You can't love someone unless you have the chance to choose not to, like that potential. And so it's like here, how can you truly grow old or start walking on your own if you don't have the potential to do something different than what Maleldil said? But he goes a step further and he's kind of like, not potential, you actually need to. You need to actually break a command. It was quite a clever thing. I mean, when you take a step back, there's again, like all of his stuff, there's some false jump and false premise built into everything, but it was a clever twist.
Yeah, and he's pushing her kind of right to the very edge, and sounding all of the things out. And, poor Ransom is doing his poor best with what he sees. And of course, we hear earlier that Maleldil isn't putting anything into my mind about this. And so Weston seems to be really weighing in, and it seems to be the whole world against Ransom. But that'll change up pretty soon here.
And the Green Lady points out a problem with epistemology, that if he told us we were to break this command, then it would be no command. And if he didn't do that, how would we know? And Weston seems to think that this is a restriction, a limitation on God, that he secretly wants this, but he can't actually command it. And this seems to be too much for the Queen. She says, I thought your words had meaning, but now it seems they have none. And this is the quotation of the week. To walk out of his will is to walk into nowhere.
Yes. It's like he says in Mere Christianity, God can't give us peace and love and joy outside of himself because there is no such thing. Or that God is the fuel on which the human machine is made to run. We are made for obedience and love for God. You hear about love all the time, and I hadn't noticed this until I read Till We Have Faces. Can't believe it took so long. Thank you. Have a drink, Matt. But the first command that he gives her is to love, which is the same command that he gives to Narnia. Narnia, Narnia, awake. And as soon as Narnia is awake, the first command to Narnia, the Narnian world, is to love. And we hear about the beloved, and we hear about love. And here we see it again. These other commands of his, to love, to sleep, to fill the world with your children, right? And so, it's the very opposite of love that he's teasing along.
Yeah, well, what's interesting here too is this was the beginning of where I really started to ask myself the question, what does she have to hang on to? Because we have more or less kind of perfect knowledge, not just from the outside reading the book, but just from history of Christian teaching would tell us for combating these kind of half-truths. But she doesn't have that. She only has her experience in Ransom. And I did appreciate here, and the word I kept coming back to and thinking through this is her experiences. I mean, both Maladil's commands leading up to this, but then her experiences have more or less validated the commands. And what is this? If you walk out of his will, you're not going to have that peace and joy. And every single time she's followed his will perfectly, it has led to an incredible beauty and joy and peace. And so why for 1 second would that switch? And she recognizes that here. She's very clear and quick to jump on that. And so that's kind of the main thing she can hold on to.
But Weston attacks that. He says, all of these other things, to love, to sleep, to fill the world with your children, all echoes of Genesis, these are obviously good things. But there's one command that doesn't apply everywhere. This idea of not sleeping on the fixed land. It doesn't apply on Earth. And so he says, well, clearly Maladil is showing you that this is just a test. He wants you to disobey this one because it's not one of these things is not like the other,
So then let me ask you this. Do you think, because here we get Ransom really comes in here, obviously. And as you can imagine, it brings the knowledge of what happened by falling for this, and it wasn't good. So thankfully, we just have perfect knowledge. Could she have countered that without Ransom here, do you think? Because that is a pretty clever point that he's making. Now, with Ransom there, it's pretty easy. It's like, no, actually, we already did this. It didn't work out. Here's all that happened, and you can imagine where that conversation goes. But without him, I'm just kind of curious your guys' thoughts on a hypothetical.
I think that Aslan would growl at you because we never know how things might have been, right? Yeah. And would Weston have even been there if it had not been for Ransom? And so this is not the story that's played out. And that's part of what Ransom struggles with. And his kind of newfound, and he's having to kind of lean into his vocation on his feet. He's like, oh, crap, I am here to defend this innocent woman against this devilish man. It's kind of like saying, what if Hamlet had a twin brother? And Lewis is kind of staging this in this magisterial, dramatic sort of way.
You mean two beings or not two beings?
Oh,
is that the question?
Yes, that was exactly what I was. No, that's great.
Well, I'll actually engage with Matt's hypothetical because
sure.
the first argument that Ransom brings is one I think that she could have got to. Because there's an alternative explanation about the uniqueness of the rule regarding sleeping on the fixed land. He says, I think Maladil made one law of that kind, so one that isn't just obviously good, in order that there might be obedience. In all these other matters, what you call obeying him is but doing what seems good in your own eyes also. Echo from the book of Judges, where all men did what was right in their own eyes. Is love content with that? Well, obviously it's not. You do them indeed because they are his will, but not only because they are his will. Where can you taste the joy of obeying unless he bids you to do something for which his bidding is the only reason? When we spoke last, you said that if you told the beasts to walk on their heads, it would be a delight to do so. So I know you understand well what I'm saying. Basically, you can only obey simply for the sake of obeying if there is a command that doesn't entirely make sense to you. You might even say that it's kind of like faith. you trust the person. And that means that you will go where they lead you and do what they say because you know the person. And it's on the strength of that, not on the strength of your ability to see the goodness in what they're asking you to do.
Yes. And you see this kind of turn right here in the chapter. He begins by addressing her, lady, a royal title. If I speak, will you hear me? He gives courtesy and he earns his place. And then he's starting to kind of find his feet in this argument. One wonders if there's a little bit of Lewis's experience at the Socratic Club, where he's brought on to argue with atheists all the time. And he's hearing subtle arguments and trying to find his way. And so he's at last kind of standing up on his feet and holding his own.
Yeah, this section ends with the lady recognizing all of this. She says, oh, how well I see it. We cannot walk out of Maleldil's will, but he has given us a way to walk out of our will. So thy will be done, basically. And there could be no such way except a command like this.
Yeah, and she calls him brave, right?
I did appreciate too here, David, this is just something that maybe a subtle way that Maleldil is influencing some of this. She goes, this is the best you've said yet. This makes me older far. Yet it does not feel like the oldness this other is giving me. So there is just like her experience continues to push against this. Like she doesn't fully, here she does rationally understand what he's saying, but also just something inside her gut, her experiential past.
And she also has a spiritual sensitivity. She has such a sensitivity because Jesus is speaking directly into her mind all the time. And when he's silent, she's knowing that. And so it's not as if she's just this, this cipher, this stupid thing that the two are fighting over. She's got some of her own game. And I love how she says, this is better. And I'm understanding it's like passing out through the world's roof into deep heaven, all beyond is love himself. And so here it is again, that love is this theme. And of course it would be the theme in a novel about Venus, right? About the god of love.
Now, Andrew, you're going to like this next section because this devil is basically arguing that wisdom naturally and automatically comes with age, because Ransom says he's not young like Weston says. And then the creature that's inside Weston says, the voice of Weston's face spoke suddenly, and it was louder and deeper than before and less like Weston's voice. I am older than he, it said, and he dare not deny it. Before the mothers of the mother were conceived, I was already older than he could reckon. I have been with Maleldil in deep heaven, where he never came, and held the eternal councils, and in the order of creation I am greater than he, and before me he is of no account.
Whoa.
And Ransom wants to lie.
Yeah.
But he says, in that air, even when truth seemed fatal. So admitting this seems like conceding the argument. He knows only truth would serve. And so he simply responds by saying, in our world, to be older is not always to be wiser. Andrew, I'm getting that on a t-shirt for you.
Good. I won't even have to throw the tennis balls from my walker at you.
Oh, I love it.
And Ransom then goes to the argument that you alluded to earlier, Matt, about the history of Earth as a defense, because all of this has been tried before.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, thankfully. I'm glad he finally realized, he's like, well, I can just point this out. Here's how this all plays out, which in fairness does open a secondary stream where we'll get to here in the next part with like, oh, well, again, cleverness of Weston. Some good came out of this. Don't you remember? We had some really great things that came out of it. And so there was like another sort of twisted, perverted half-truth.
We see kind of an advance in Lewis's argumentative and dialectical tactic here, too. He realizes that he doesn't have to meet every argument point for point for point. And he can he's starting to think on his feet. He's kind of like a boxer. And instead of just trading blows, he's kind of circling around and finding a weak spot. And so he doesn't, and in our struggle against the enemy, we don't always have to respond directly to the attack that we feel, and so isn't it interesting? It happens every year. We're the Christmas show, the Ditchfield family Christmas show, where the gospel of the nativity is proclaimed, is tomorrow night. And almost without fail, every year, people in the group are sick, they have troubles, things come up at work, there's almost always some form of attack. And I'm not saying that the devils are trying to stop my family from singing, but nevertheless, the proclamation of the gospel is hateful to the enemy. And so to be able to step back and go, oh, certainly the enemy is going to try to stop whatever good I would do. There's wisdom in that. And that's part of what we see Ransom doing here. He's moving and seeing, okay, this is what this is. Let me see if I can find another way to combat that.
And Weston even uses the gospel as an argument, because Ransom is saying, listen, this has been tried before on Earth with disastrous consequences. But Weston says, but so much great stuff came out of it. The first part sort of sounds like Weston when he was on Malacandra talking about the glories of man. Here, he says, hardness came out of it, but also splendor. They made with their own hands mountains higher than your fixed island. So, skyscrapers. They made for themselves floating islands greater than yours, which could move at will through the ocean faster than any bird can fly. So they built great ships. So he's talking about the technological prowess. And then he goes actually into sacrifice. Because there was not always enough food, consequence of the fall, a woman could give the only fruit to her child or husband and eat death instead. So he's saying that sacrifice is only possible because of this, which is actually one of the explanations for the problem of pain. But not only that, so not only that when on earth we threw off God, we did great technological things, we suffered, so we had the opportunity for great courage and heroism, but then he even points to Christ. He says, it was this breaking of the commandment which brought Perelandra to our world, and because of which he was made man. And Ransom remembers the Latin phrase, Felix peccatum Adai, O happy fault of Adam.
Some branches will call this falling forward. But even that struggle, there's better ways to think about it than what he finds.
How does Ransom respond to this? Because, it's quite an argument of, lots of bad things happen with the fall, but lots of great things. We got Jesus.
No, he doesn't deny it. He actually says, is Perelandra a beast that we can stop his path, or a leaf that we can twist his shape? Whatever you do, he will make good of it, but not the good he had prepared for you if you had obeyed him. That is lost forever. I loved that last part. A little bit chilling, actually. I was thinking of my own life whenever you make decisions, and sometimes, God is going to honor, and if you're trying to do your best, but sometimes if you make mistakes and go different ways, I was like, man, no, it's like, there goes that great one, lost forever. He'll do what he can with what I gave him. But
I was speaking with a friend, a single friend who would love to be married, and just having a conversation about that. And he was mentioning, well, I've got this other relationship. I know it's not going to be permanent, but perhaps this might, be a way of kind of an oasis of comfort and fellowship and, affection along the way. And I suggested that maybe saying no to that might be making a sacrifice for the wife that God may someday send to you. And so maybe accepting the terrible loneliness and not evading that, not avoiding the burden of the suffering that I am facing right now, can be a contributor to a greater good, And he said, wow, I hadn't thought about that. And, and I hope that in the years to come, he's able to say to his wife, please God, hey, I had a chance, and for the sake of you, I chose loneliness instead of the comforts along the way. And it's like the scripture that said that Moses chose not to enjoy the fruits of the sin for a season, but chose hardness and austerity. He chose to be with the children of Israel rather than life in the palace. And whenever we say no to ourselves for the sake of God and his gospel, there is a reward for all of that.
And I would suggest anybody that's in a relationship that you shouldn't be in, there's a line from the movie, I think it's called The Shop Girl, with Steve Martin and Claire Danes. She says, I can either hurt now or I can hurt later.
Ooh.
But returning to the argument, Ransom actually turns the tables on Weston, because Weston's saying, hey, you guys got Jesus. And he says, well, what good came to you? Do you rejoice that Perelandra became a man? Tell her of your joys and what profit you had when you made Perelandra and death acquainted.
Yes.
And
Love
he howls like a dog.
Yes.
And interestingly, the Green Lady falls asleep. As like an echo of Psalm 4, I lie down in peace and sleep comes at once, because in you, O Lord, I dwell secure.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic.
Can you unpack that a little bit more? So what did he say? What good came from you? What was he referring to with Weston? Like, what good came to you?
So he's talking to Satan. Remember even the first prophecy in the garden, that you will crush his heel, but he will crush your head. And so when Christ, blessed be he, became a man and then died and rose again, Satan may have felt like he triumphed by killing Christ, but what actually happened was glory and the undoing. And so the incarnation, even though Satan's triumph in the garden required the second person of the Trinity to incarnate, to become man. And that led to Satan's ultimate defeat. And so that's what Ransom is referring to. And Satan is howling at the glory of the incarnation, which led to the crushing of his head.
And Andrew, in theological terms, what do we call that idea of the atonement? It's the ransom theory.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
That the death of Christ was a ransom sacrifice to Satan.
Yeah, that's one of the theories or approaches to the atonement. And that's part of why his name is Ransom. We find out at the end of the book, although
no spoilers.
Even further, we find out that, we find out that Ransom is a pseudonym. And so there's a little bit of, I think, inconsistency in Lewis's composition.
I will defend it when it comes.
Okay.
But pivoting from the ransom theory, there's also a theory of the atonement called Christus Victor. And that's the idea basically that Christ hooked the devil like a fish on a fishing pole, that he presented himself as a sacrifice. And so when death embraced him, death itself was therefore destroyed.
But help me understand right now, this seems like it's supposed to come across as a gotcha moment, aha moment, but like there seems to be an inconsistency here, like an illogical inconsistency. Like if as Ransom's pointing out, the whole incarnation did not work out well for the devil, Weston in this case, but why would Weston be trying to cause a second fall? The first one didn't work out so well for him. So like, why is he coming here trying to?
Because he's a thief and a liar, and all he wants to do is destroy stuff. Remember the Michael Caine quote, or some men just want to see the world burn.
Yes.
But what he's been doing is he's been trying to say, look, you guys got Jesus. See how all the good stuff that came out of this, even though that it was the moment of Satan's own defeat. He can't win. He probably knows he can't win, but he wants to take as many people down as he can and destroy and mar God's creation to the best of his ability. And he's willing to use any argument to make that happen.
Well, and one of the things, I think you said, what sense does it make? And of course, it's evil. It's pure evil. It doesn't make sense. It corrupts sense. It uses sense to lead to insanity.
Andrew, help me understand. Wasn't when Satan did it, like, let's call it the first go around. And I realize this is a book, so this is not necessarily representative of real theology. The first go around, he didn't know the incarnation was going to happen. God knew the incarnation was going to happen, but Satan didn't. So it makes sense why he would cause this, thinking he had an actual chance to win. Then he finds out in the end he doesn't have a chance to win because of the incarnation. But now he's like, the second time, this sounds like lunacy now. First time actually sounded logical. Now it's like, so I guess the short answer is the only way to reconcile this inconsistency is he is insane, definition of insanity.
Or he possibly thinks that he can win this time around.
I guess, delusional. Yeah, that's true.
There's a fundamental self-delusion about the enemy. And if you look at Isaiah 14, the 7 I am statements, I will make myself like the Most High. God wants to make us like him, but he wants to do it in us rather than us saying, no, thanks for your help, God. I'll go ahead and make myself godlike. And there's a fundamental, and remember, it's out of the self towards the other. And Satan ultimately can never get over himself. He is always consumed with his own brightness, with his own position. He's always concerned with himself and never concerned with the source of the light which he is reflecting, right? It's like the moon being proud of itself for being bright, right? But if it weren't for the sun, the moon would never be bright. And yet the moon, somebody should write a parable about the moon proud of itself for its light, right? And denying the fact that half of it is always dark. And so Satan is ultimately self-obsessed, and all selfishness, right? Pride, self-centeredness, that's the original sin. And that's his original sin, and that's our original sin too. He lost that time, but why would he even try to make himself like God when God was willing to make him like him? I mean, there is a self-delusion and an insanity to sin. And if I think about my own sin, the times when I say, well, okay, it's all right this time, or it's all right because, right? Whatever sin it is, that's delusion. And repentance brings clarity of thought. Right. And so there's a delusional quality anytime I say, it's what does Shakespeare say? Before a joy proposed, behind a dream. Right. It's never the right idea. There is never a good time to commit sin. But we do that every day, and we lie to ourselves and about the nature of God and about the consequences of our actions. And where did that come from except from the father of lies? That's where all those lies come from.
And as Lewis says in the preface to the Screwtape Letters, there's wishful thinking even in hell.
Yes, nice grab.
And Ransom watches Weston move about, and it's incredibly creepy. And this is where he describes him as a managed corpse, a bogey, the Unman. And I think that's what we're going to be calling Weston moving forward.
David. Nothing.
Fell for it.
So tell us, Matt, how does the chapter end?
Pretty much just like complete and utter pettiness. Ransom or Weston is just asking Ransom, calling his name, and then Ransom's yes, nothing. Ransom, nothing. And then it kind of descends into like Ransom, Ransom, Ransom. I mean, it's unreal.
And I think there's actually a profound truth there, because Ransom asks him what he wants, and he says nothing.
Mm-hmm.
That is what he wants. Nothing. He wants everything.
Oh,
right. And nothing indeed is very strong.
Nothing indeed is very strong.
Yeah, from Screwtape.
I think this also just shows the pettiness and smallness of evil, just this kind of taunt. The Unman has lost this round effectively, and so he's going to take it out with the pettiest revenge he can think of.
Yes, and I love this. This petty, indefatigable nagging as of a nasty little boy at a preparatory school. There we are again. On the surface, great designs and an antagonism to heaven which involved the fate of the worlds, but deep within, when every veil has been pierced, was there, after all, nothing but a black puerility. Puer means child, so puerility, a childlikeness, a black childlikeness, an aimless, empty spitefulness content to sate itself with the tiniest cruelties, as love does not sustain the smallest kindness. He's the opposite of love. When you read Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, he's given all the power in the world, and he ends up like going around and playing jokes on stable boys. He's given this incredible power, and he doesn't use the power for even great, great evil. He just kind of, fondles himself and fondles his own, pettiness. And so that's some of what we see, is that in the end, there is this refusal, and puerility is a childness and a refusal to grow older, right? And so after trying to make her older, we realize that this character embodying or, possessing Weston is not old at all. And there's a fundamental lack and a smallness to him that we find. So what an incredible chapter. Ransom, ransom, ransom.
Well, gentlemen, I hear the final call for drinks. So thank you to our intern, Julia, our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah, and our Patreon supporters and our top tier ones, Jody, Robert, whom we toasted today, Mark, my wife, Mary Margaret. I'm pretty sure she updated it finally. Rowdy, Angela, David, Peter, Kate, James, John, Sarah, Rebecca, Meg, and Brian, Joanna, Kelly, Stephen, Gary, Paul, Kay, Becca, Shane, Thomas, Amanda, Joelle, Erica, Matt, James, Bud 1, Bud 2, Edgar, Aldo, Kevin, and Mark. And of course, we are so grateful for all of you guys listening.
And please join us next time,
when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.